The morning sun reflected off Crystal Lake like scattered diamonds. When Jake Matthews first laid eyes on his grandfather's old cabin, after 3 months of legal paperwork and estate settlements, he was finally ready to move into the rustic retreat that had been in his family for over 40 years. The property sat onto pristine acres with direct lake access, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets in the mountain breeze. Jake had barely finished unloading the first box from his pickup truck when he heard the unmistakable click of high heels on gravel. He turned to see a woman in her early 50s marching toward him with the determination of a general heading into battle. Her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't move despite the morning wind, and her pressed, cocky outfit screamed suburban authority figure. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the kind of artificial sweetness that immediately put Jake on guard. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Jake set down his box and extended a friendly hand. "Jake Matthews. Just inherited this place from my grandfather, Thomas Matthews. Nice to meet you." Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place like a rubber band. "Oh yes, Thomas. Lovely man. But he was always a bit independent. I'm sure you'll be much more community-minded." She gestured toward a thick folder tucked under her arm. "I've brought you all the HOA documentation you'll need to sign. Annual dues are $800, and there are quite a few regulations about property maintenance, landscaping standards, and of course, our noise ordinances." "I appreciate you stopping by," Jake said carefully, "but I'm not interested in joining an HOA. My grandfather never mentioned being part of one, and honestly, I prefer to handle my own property maintenance." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Karen's smile became razor thin. "I'm afraid you don't understand, Mr. Matthews. This isn't optional. Every property around Crystal Lake is required to be part of our association. It's been that way for 15 years. Jake shook his head politely. "I've reviewed all the property documents with my attorney. There's no HOA covenant on this land. My family has owned this property since 1983, long before any association was formed." "That's impossible," Karen snapped, her facade of politeness finally cracking. "Every single property owner around this lake is part of our HOA. We've worked too hard building this community to have some outsider come in and disrupt everything we've accomplished. Look, Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you've put effort into organizing the neighborhood, but my property simply isn't subject to HOA rules. I'm planning to restore the cabin, maybe add a small dock, and just enjoy the peaceful lake life my grandfather loved so much." Karen's face flushed red. "A dock? Absolutely not. Any waterfront modifications require HOA approval, environmental impact studies, and neighbor consent. And that cabin of yours is an eyesore that brings down all our property values. The association has standards, Mr. Matthews." Jake felt his own patience wearing thin. "With all due respect, what I do with my own property is my business. I'm not looking to cause problems, but I'm also not going to let anyone dictate how I use land that's been in my family for decades." "We'll see about that," Karen hissed, her professional mask completely abandoned now. "There are legal ways too." Handle property owners who refuse to be good neighbors. I'll be contacting our attorney first thing Monday morning." As she spun on her heel and stalked back toward her pristine white SUV. Jake heard her muttering under her breath about property theft and illegal occupation. He watched her speed away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled ominously over his moving boxes. His neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who'd been watering his garden during the entire exchange, wandered over with a sympathetic shake of his head. "I tried to warn her you weren't going to be a pushover like some folks around here," Frank said with a chuckle. "Your grandfather was cut from the same cloth. Stubborn as a mule when he knew he was right. How bad is this going to get?" Frank, the old man's expression grew serious, with Karen Whitmore. "Son, you haven't seen anything yet. That woman has made it her personal mission to control every blade of grass around this lake. She's gone after 3 other property owners in the past 2 years. And let me tell you, she doesn't give up easy." As Jake unpacked his belongings that afternoon, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's parting threat hadn't been an empty promise. Something about the way she'd mentioned legal ways and property theft suggested she had more up her sleeve than a simple attorney consultation. What would you have done faced with such an aggressive HOA president? Jake was about to find out that Karen Whitmore's idea of legal action was far more dramatic than he could have imagined. By Tuesday morning, Jake had almost convinced himself that Karen's threats were just bluster from an overzealous neighborhood busybody. He spent Monday settling into the cabin, organizing his grandfather's old tools, and planning the restoration work he wanted to tackle. The peaceful sound of lapping waves and chirping birds made the confrontation with Karen feel like a distant bad dream. That illusion shattered at exactly 8:47 a.m. when Jake heard car doors slamming outside his cabin. Through the window, he watched in disbelief as 2 sheriff's deputies approached his front door, followed closely by Karen Whitmore, who wore the expression of someone who just won a game of chess. The knock on his door was firm and official. "Sheriff's Department, we need to speak with you, sir." Jake opened the door to find Deputy Rodriguez, a serious-looking man in his 30s, and Deputy Chen, a younger officer who seemed slightly uncomfortable with whatever they were about to discuss. Behind them, Karen stood with her arms crossed, practically vibrating with self-righteousness. "Are you Jake Matthews?" Deputy Rodriguez asked. "Yes, sir." "Is there a problem? We've received a complaint about possible trespassing and illegal occupation of this property. Mrs. Whitmore here claims you're refusing to comply with legal property agreements and may be unlawfully residing on HOA-controlled land." Jake's jaw dropped. "Trespassing? This is my property. I inherited it from my grandfather 3 months ago. I have all the legal documentation." Karen stepped forward with theatrical concern. "Officers, I've tried reasoning with Mr. Matthews, but he refuses to acknowledge the legal HOA covenant that covers this entire lakefront area. He's essentially squatting on community property and making unauthorized modifications." "What modifications?" Jake asked incredulously. "I haven't modified anything except unpacking my clothes." "You've been clearing brush without environmental permits," Karen continued smoothly. "And I have it on good authority that you're planning illegal dock construction that will damage our protected shoreline." Deputy Rodriguez looked between Jake and Karen with the weary expression of someone who dealt with neighborhood disputes before. Mr. Matthews, do you have documentation proving ownership of this property? Absolutely. Jake retrieved their folder containing his inheritance paperwork, property deed, and title documents. Everything's been processed through probate court. My attorney handled all the legal requirements. As Deputy Rodriguez examined the documents, Karen's confidence never wavered. Officers, I'm sure his paperwork looks official, but the HOA has legal standing over all lakefront properties. We've consulted with our attorney, and Mr. Matthews is in violation of multiple covenants, whether he acknowledges them or not. Deputy Chen spoke up for the first time. Ma'am, these documents appear to be in order. The property deed clearly shows Mr. Matthews as the legal owner. But what about the HOA covenants? Karen insisted, surely property ownership doesn't override community agreements that protect everyone's investment. Jake felt his frustration building. There are no HOA covenants on my property. My grandfather never signed any agreements with your association. This land has been in my family since 1983. That's impossible. Karen shot back. Every property round Crystal Lake is part of our HOA. We have records going back 15 years. 15 years? Jake repeated slowly. But my family has owned this property for over 40 years. We were here long before your HOA existed. Deputy Rodriguez handed the documents back to Jake. Sir, based on these legal documents, you appear to be the rightful owner of this property. Unless Mrs. Whitmore can provide legal documentation proving HOA authority over this specific parcel, there's no basis for a trespassing complaint. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is ridiculous. You can't just ignore community standards because you have some old paperwork. What about property values? What about our environmental protections? What about the integrity of our neighborhood? Ma'am, Deputy Chen said gently, property ownership is pretty straightforward. If Mr. Matthews has clear title to this land, he has the right to use it within locals owning less. But the HOA doesn't have authority over properties that were never subject to its covenants. Deputy Rodriguez explained, if this property predates your association and was never voluntarily joined, then your rules don't apply. Jake watched Karen's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and what looked like genuine panic. For the first time since their confrontation began, she seemed to realize that her authority might not extend as far as she'd believed. This isn't over, she said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. I'll be contacting our legal team immediately. There has to be some way to enforce community standards. As the deputies prepared to leave, Deputy Rodriguez turned back to Jake. Sir, you might want to document any future interactions with Mrs. Whitmore. Neighborhood disputes can escalate quickly, and it's better to have a paper trail if things get more complicated. Frank appeared from his garden as the official vehicles departed. Well, that was quite a show, he said, shaking his head. Karen's really pulling out all the stops this time. Has she done this before? Called the cops on neighbors? Twice that I know of. But both those times, the properties actually were part of the HOA. Frank paused, studying Jake with curious eyes. Your grandfather never mentioned anything about Karen trying to force him into the association. Not a word. But then again, Grandpa wasn't much for complaining about other people's nonsense. As Frank headed back to his garden, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's panic had seemed about more than just losing an argument about HOA authority. There had been something almost desperate in her eyes when the deputies confirmed his property ownership. What would you have done when the cops showed up at your door? Jake was about to discover that Karen Whitmore's desperation ran much deeper than simple neighborhood control. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor that would change everything Jake thought he knew about his conflict with Karen Whitmore. Harold Brennan, a distinguished man in his 70s wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a weathered briefcase, knocked on Jake's door just as the morning mist was lifting off Crystal Lake. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Harold Brennan, your grandfather's attorney. I apologize for not reaching out sooner, but there's been a development regarding your inheritance that requires immediate attention." Jake invited Harold inside, offering coffee. As they settled into the cabin's small living area, the attorney's serious expression suggested this wasn't a social call. "I've been handling your grandfather's legal affairs for over 20 years, Harold began, "and there's something about your property situation that wasn't included in the initial inheritance paperwork. Your grandfather specifically requested that certain information only be revealed if problems rose with the local HOA. Problems have definitely risen," Jake said, recounting his confrontations with Karen and the previous day's visit from the sheriff's deputies. Harold nodded grimly. "Then it's time you knew the full story. Your grandfather owned more than just this cabin property, Jake. Much more." The attorney opened his briefcase and spread several documents across the coffee table. "Thomas Matthews was what you might call a silent real estate investor. Over the past 30 years, he quietly purchased several properties around Crystal Lake through various LLCs and trusts." Jake studied the documents, his confusion growing. "I don't understand. Why would Grandpa keep this secret?" "Because," Harold said with a slight smile, "your grandfather had a particular dislike for busybodies and control freaks. When the Crystal Lake HOA formed 15 years ago, several property owners approached him about selling land for their community development plans. Thomas refused, but he was curious about their long-term intentions." The attorney pulled out a property map that made Jake's coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. Red lines marked various parcels round the lake, with dates of purchase and ownership details. "Your grandfather owns the land under 12 of the HOA properties," Harold continued, "including the community center, the private beach area, and most importantly, the house belonging to one Karen Whitmore." Jake stared at the map in stunned silence. "Are you telling me that Karen Whitmore has been threatening to sue me for trespassing on land that I actually own? Not just land you own," Harold said. "Land that she's been leasing from your grandfather for the past 8 years. Thomas set up the arrangements through a property management company, so most tenants never knew they were dealing with him directly." The irony hit Jake like a physical blow. "She's been demanding I join her HOA and follow her rules. Well, she's been paying rent to my family the entire time." "It gets better," Harold said, pulling out another document. "Mrs. Whitmore is currently 3 months behind on her lease payments. Your grandfather was a patient man, but he'd started formal collection proceedings just before he passed away. Jake's mind raced through the implications. Karen's desperate insistence that he join the HOA, her panic when the deputies confirmed his property ownership, her threats about legal action, it all made sense now. She wasn't just trying to maintain neighborhood control, she was terrified that her new landlord might discover her financial situation. How many other HOA members know about this arrangement? Very few, Harold replied. Your grandfather preferred discretion in his business dealings. But here's the critical part. Jake, all of these lease agreements are coming up for renewal in the next 6 months. As the new owner, you have complete authority over whether to renew them, modify the terms, or terminate the leases entirely. The weight of this revelation settled over Jake like a heavy blanket. He wasn't just some outsider refusing to join Karen's HOA. He was effectively the HOA's biggest landlord, with the power to dissolve their entire community structure if he chose. What would you have done in my grandfather's position? Jake asked. Why did he set things up this way? Harold chuckled. Thomas said he wanted to see how people behaved when they thought they had power over others. He was particularly interested in whether the HOA would become a genuine community organization or just a tool for petty tyrants. And what was his conclusion, based on his notes? He was not impressed with Mrs. Whitmore's leadership style. He'd actually drafted a letter terminating her lease agreement, but he passed away before sending it. Jake walked to the window overlooking Crystal Lake, watching Karen's house in the distance. The woman who'd threatened him with legal action called the police on him and demanded he comply with her authority was not only his tenant, but a tenant in arrears who could be evicted at his discretion. Harold, what are my legal options here? Considerable, the attorney replied. You could demand immediate payment of back rent, terminate the lease for non-payment, or continue the arrangement under new terms. You could also choose to sell the properties, though that would require proper notice to current tenants. As Harold packed up his documents, Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Frank next door. Karen's having some kind of emergency HOA meeting at her house tonight. Looks like she's called in reinforcements. That you should know. Jake looked at the property map one more time, a plan beginning to form in his mind. Karen Whitmore had escalated their conflict far beyond reasonable neighborhood discourse. She'd involved law enforcement, made false accusations, and threatened legal action against her own landlord. It was time for the tables to turn completely. What would you have done with this kind of leverage over someone who'd been threatening you? Jake was about to show Karen Whitmore exactly what real authority looked like. The emergency HOA meeting at Karen's house was in full swing when Jake arrived unannounced at 7:30 p.m. Through the large front windows, he could see about 20 residents crowded into Karen's living room, their faces serious as she gestured dramatically at what appeared to be legal documents and property maps. Jake knocked firmly on the front door. Harold Brennan beside him carrying his briefcase full of property deeds and lease agreements. The conversation inside stopped abruptly. Karen opened the door with an expression of pure outrage. What are you doing here? This is a private HOA meeting for community members only, actually. Mrs. Whitmore, Jake said calmly, "I think I have more right to be here than anyone else. May we come in?" Before Karen could respond, Frank's voice called out from inside, "Let him in, Karen. I want to hear what he has to say." Reluctantly, Karen stepped aside as Jake and Harold entered the living room. The assembled residents looked curious, but wary, clearly having been told some version of events that painted Jake as a troublemaker threatening their community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen announced with theatrical authority, "this is Jake Matthews, the man who's refusing to comply with our HOA regulations and threatening the stability of our entire commune." Why, Jake looked around the room at faces he was just beginning to recognize, neighbors who'd been watching his conflict with Karen unfold. "I appreciate you all being here tonight. It gives me a chance to address some misunderstandings that Mrs. Whitmore has been spreading." Harold stepped forward, opening his briefcase. "My name is Harold Brennan. I was Thomas Matthews' attorney for over 20 years, and I'm here to clarify some important facts about property ownership around Crystal Lake." Karen's face went pale. "This is highly irregular. Legal matters should be handled through proper channels, not ambushed in community meetings." "Ambushed?" Jake asked with mild amusement. "Like calling the sheriff's department to report me for trespassing on my own property." A murmur went through the crowd. Several residents exchanged glances, clearly not having heard this part of the story. Harold began spreading documents on Karen's coffee table. "These are property deeds and lease agreements that I think everyone here should understand. Thomas Matthews didn't just own the cabin where Jake now lives. He owned the land under 12 properties in this community." The room went dead silent. Karen's face cycled through several shades of red and white. "That's impossible," she whispered, including, Harold continued, "the land under this house. Mrs. Whitmore, you've been Thomas's tenant for 8 years, paying monthly lease fees through Lakeside Property Management." A woman near the back of the room stood up slowly. "Are you saying Karen doesn't own her house? She owns the structure," Harold explained, "but not the land it sits on. The same is true for 11 other properties here. Mr. Matthews' grandfather was, shall we say, a very quiet real estate investor." Jake watched the realization dawn on face after face around the room. The woman who'd been demanding he follow HOA rules, who'd threatened him with legal action and called the cops on him, was actually his tenant. Furthermore, Harold continued, "Mrs. Whitmore is currently 3 months behind on her lease payments, totaling $4,800 in arrears." Karen finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous. You can't just show up and make wild claims." "These are claims," Jake interrupted gently. "These are legal documents filed with the county recorder's office. Would you like to call the sheriff's department again to verify their authenticity?" Frank started laughing first, a deep belly laugh that seemed to break the tension in the room. "Karen, you've been threatening to sue your own landlord for not joining the HOA." Other residents began talking among themselves, the absurdity of the situation sinking in. A man Jake didn't recognize raised his hand. "So what does this mean for the rest of us? Are we all going to be evicted?" Jake had been hoping someone would ask that question. "That depends entirely on how we move forward as a community. I inherited these properties. But I didn't inherit my grandfather's opinions about how they should be managed. He looked directly at Karen. Mrs. Whitmore, you've spent the past week threatening me with legal action, filing false police reports, and trying to force me to comply with rules that don't apply to my property. That's not the kind of neighbor relationship I'm interested in having. What are you saying? Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that effective immediately. I'm exercising my right as the landlord to terminate your lease agreement for non-payment and breach of good neighbor clauses that are standard in all the lease agreements. Immense. The room erupted in surprised chatter. Harold handed Karen an official-looking document, 30 days notice of lease termination, as required by state law. Karen stared at the document in shock. You can't do this. I've built my whole life around this community. You should have thought about that before you decided to wage war against your landlord. Jake replied, as for the rest of you, I'm willing to work with anyone who's interested in being a genuine neighbor rather than following someone who thinks authority means bullying people into submission. Frank raised his hand. Jake, what would you want from us as neighbors? Honestly, just be decent people, take care of your properties, be respectful of each other, and maybe help out when someone needs a hand. You know, the kind of community your grandfather probably hoped this place would become over the next hour. Jake found himself in conversations with residents who seemed genuinely relieved to escape Karen's authoritarian version of community management. Several people apologized for not speaking up earlier when they'd witnessed her aggressive behavior. As the meeting broke up, Karen approached Jake one final time. You're making a mistake, she said quietly. I've put years of work into building this community. No, Mrs. Whitmore, Jake replied. You put years of work into building your own little kingdom. There's a difference. 2 weeks later, Karen's moving truck pulled away from Crystal Lake for the last time. The HOA quietly dissolved itself, replaced by a simple neighborhood association, focused on voluntary cooperation rather than mandatory compliance. Jake never did build that dock his grandfather had dreamed of, but he did organize a community barbecue where neighbors could get to know each other without anyone checking rule books or measuring grass height. Sometimes the best way to handle a neighborhood tyrant is simply to give them enough rope to hang themselves with. Karen Whitmore had threatened the wrong person, and in doing so, she revealed the true nature of the power she thought she wielded. What would you have done in Jake's position? Sometimes standing up to bullies requires more than just refusing to back down. Sometimes it requires showing them exactly how little power they actually had all along. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of or what you would have done in my place. And hey, if this story hits something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're HOA Headache Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.